Okay, so you want to own a data center. Rows of humming server racks stretching under cool blue light, blinking lights by the thousands. A facility so critical to modern life that if it went dark for even an hour, hospitals, banks, airlines, and half the apps on your phone would feel it immediately. You picture yourself as the owner of the invisible infrastructure that runs the internet itself, collecting rent from the world's biggest tech companies who need somewhere to put their servers. That's the fantasy. Here's the actual business hiding underneath it, an industry where the single biggest cost isn't the building. It's the electricity, where a facility can cost $500 million before a single customer moves in, and where the entire business now finds itself in a genuine, well-documented supply crunch because the artificial intelligence boom is consuming power and space faster than anyone can build it. Some data center owners are becoming extraordinarily wealthy right now, locking in decade-long leases with the world's largest tech companies at premium rates. Some are stuck holding older facilities that can't handle the power density modern AI computing requires, watching their buildings quietly become obsolete while still carrying the debt used to build them. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why this has become one of the most capital-intensive, power-hungry, and suddenly, one of the most sought-after real estate businesses in the world. What you're actually buying a data center is not simply a big building full of computers. And understanding the difference is the entire key to this business. There are three fundamentally different models hiding under the same name. The first is a wholesale colocation facility, where the owner builds and operates the building, the power infrastructure, and the cooling systems, and then leases out space, power capacity, and rack footprint to customers who bring and manage their own servers. The second is a hyperscale build-to-suit facility, an enormous, custom-built data center constructed specifically for a single massive tenant, almost always one of the handful of companies running global cloud computing platforms, under a long-term lease often running 15 to 20 years. The third, increasingly rare model, is a retail colocation facility, a smaller operation serving many different business customers who each need a modest amount of server space, more like renting out individual storage units than leasing an entire warehouse. These are genuinely different businesses wearing the same industry label. A hyperscale facility built for a single cloud computing giant is closer to a long-term, triple net lease industrial property, extremely predictable, extremely low risk once the lease is signed, but requiring an enormous, precisely specified upfront investment tailored to exactly one tenant's technical requirements. A retail colocation facility is a genuinely operational business, managing dozens or hundreds of smaller customer relationships, more exposed to churn, but with considerably more pricing power per square foot. This script focuses primarily on the wholesale and hyperscale models, since that's where the overwhelming majority of new capital and new construction in this industry is currently flowing. The land and power problem here is the single fact that has completely reshaped this industry over the past several years, and it explains almost every headline you've seen about data center construction. The limiting factor is no longer land, it's electricity. According to data tracked by CBRE and other commercial real estate research firms that closely follow this sector, primary data center markets in the United States, places like Northern Virginia, which alone handles a meaningful share of the entire world's internet traffic, have seen available power capacity effectively sell out years in advance, with new supply already fully pre-leased before construction even breaks ground. Northern Virginia's Loudoun County, often called Data Center Alley, has become so saturated that local utilities have had to significantly slow down or delay new connection approvals simply because the regional power grid cannot supply new capacity fast enough to meet demand. This has pushed developers into what the industry calls secondary and emerging markets, places like Columbus, Ohio, Phoenix, Arizona, and parts of Texas, specifically because those regions still have available power capacity and utilities willing to build new substations and transmission lines to serve a data center customer. Land itself, meanwhile, has become almost a secondary consideration. A hyperscale data center campus might require anywhere from 50 to 200 acres for a large multi-building development, but land acquisition typically represents a relatively modest 5 to 10% of total project costs, a dramatically different ratio than the golf course or vineyard businesses we've covered, where land was the single dominant expense. Here, the dominant expense is securing what the industry calls power capacity, meaning a guaranteed, contracted allocation of electricity from the local utility or grid operator. And in the hottest markets, developers are now signing power purchase agreements and grid interconnection contracts years before a building is even designed, because the queue for new large-scale electrical connections in constrained markets can stretch 3 to 7 years to grid capacity studies, required infrastructure upgrades, and utility construction timelines. The cost of building the things you have land and a viable path to power. The actual construction cost is genuinely staggering, and it's risen sharply over the past several years as the industry has shifted toward the extremely high power density required by AI computing workloads. According to cost data tracked by JLL and CBRE in their annual data center construction cost reports, building a traditional, general-purpose data center runs somewhere between $7 million and $12 million per megawatt of critical IT capacity, a figure that captures the building shell, the electrical infrastructure, the cooling systems, and the fire suppression and security systems required. But AI-focused data centers, the ones built specifically to house the graphics processing units that power modern artificial intelligence, have driven that cost meaningfully higher, often running $10 million to $15 million per megawatt or more, because the extreme heat generated by densely packed AI computing chips requires far more sophisticated and expensive cooling infrastructure than traditional data centers ever needed. A large hyperscale campus, the kind being built by and for the major cloud computing platforms, might target 100 to 300 megawatts of total capacity across multiple buildings, meaning total project costs on the largest developments can run into the billions of dollars, sometimes several $billion for a single campus. Break down where that money actually goes, and the electrical infrastructure, the substations, switch gear, backup generators, and uninterruptible power supply systems that guarantee power never actually goes out, typically consumes 40 to 50% of total construction costs, making it by far the single largest cost category. Cooling systems, historically simple air conditioning, but increasingly sophisticated liquid cooling systems required for high-density AI chip racks, represent another significant chunk, often 15 to 25% of total cost depending on how AI-intensive the facility's design is. The building shell itself, the actual concrete and steel structure, is comparatively modest, often just 10 to 15% of total project costs, an almost inverted version of a normal commercial real estate project where the building itself is usually the dominant expense. The backup power obsession here is a detail that surprises people who haven't spent time inside this industry. A data center's entire value proposition depends on never, under any circumstances, losing power, and the infrastructure built to guarantee that creates one of the strangest cost structures in all of commercial real estate. Every serious data center is built with an uninterruptible power supply system, essentially enormous battery banks capable of bridging the gap of a few seconds to a few minutes between a utility power failure and backup generators kicking in. And those battery systems alone can cost millions of dollars for a large facility and require periodic, expensive replacement as battery technology ages. Behind that sits a fleet of diesel or natural gas backup generators, sized to run the entire facility at full capacity indefinitely, and a large hyperscale data center can require dozens of generators, each costing hundreds of thousands to over $1 million, plus the substantial on-site fuel storage tanks needed to keep them running for days during an extended outage. According to the Uptime Institute, an organization that certifies data center reliability standards, facilities are rated according to a tier system, with Tier 4 representing the highest level of redundancy. meaning every single piece of critical infrastructure, power feeds, cooling systems, network connections, exists in a fully duplicated, fault-tolerant configuration where any single component can fail without causing any customer-facing downtime. Building to tier for standards doesn't just mean building the primary system. It means building the entire electrical and cooling infrastructure twice over, in parallel, which is a major reason why the most reliable facilities cost dramatically more than a basic, low redundancy building. This obsessive redundancy exists because the financial and reputational cost of an outage at a major data center is genuinely catastrophic. A single significant outage at a facility serving major cloud computing customers can trigger service-level agreement penalty payments running into the tens of millions of dollars, plus lasting reputational damage that can affect a data center operator's ability to sign future, long-term leases with major tenants who simply cannot tolerate the business risk of unreliable infrastructure. The bill that never stops arriving here. Where data center economics reveals its true character, and it's a genuinely unusual one compared to almost any other type of commercial real estate we've examined. In a typical office building or warehouse, the landlord's ongoing operating costs are relatively modest and predictable. In a data center, electricity itself is not just an operating cost, it's arguably the core product being sold, repackaged and delivered alongside physical space and cooling. According to industry benchmarking data, electricity can represent 30 to 60% of a data center's total ongoing operating costs, and this is before even accounting for the electricity the tenants themselves consume running their servers, which in most leasing arrangements gets passed through directly to the tenant based on actual metered usage. The facility's own operating electricity, meaning the power required to run the cooling systems, the backup infrastructure, the lighting and security systems, and general building operations, can still run into the millions of dollars annually for a large facility. And this is exactly why data centers have become so aggressively focused on a metric called power usage effectiveness, or PUE, which measures how much total electricity a facility consumes for every unit of electricity that actually reaches the computing equipment. A poorly designed older facility might have a PUE of 2.0, meaning it uses a full extra unit of electricity in overhead for every unit that reaches the servers themselves. A well-designed modern hyperscale facility can achieve a PUE closer to 1.1 or 1.2, an enormous efficiency advantage that translates directly into lower operating costs and higher effective profit margins, and is one of the central reasons older, less efficient facilities are increasingly struggling to compete for premium tenants, even when they still have plenty of physical space available. Cooling costs stack on top of raw electricity costs, since data centers, particularly the high-density AI-focused facilities now dominating new construction, generate enormous amounts of waste heat that has to be actively removed, and increasingly this means water, not just electricity. Some large data centers consume hundreds of thousands to over 1 million gallons of water per day for cooling purposes, a genuinely significant resource draw that has made water availability, much like electrical capacity, an increasingly important site selection factor and, in some water-stressed regions, a source of real community friction and regulatory pushback. Add property taxes, security staffing, ongoing maintenance on an enormously complex mechanical and electrical infrastructure, and insurance, and a large data center's annual operating costs can easily run into the tens of millions of dollars. A bill that arrives every single month regardless of how full or empty the facility happens to be. How the money actually comes back. The revenue model in this business is refreshingly straightforward compared to almost everything else we've covered. And that simplicity is a large part of why institutional real estate investors have become so aggressively interested in this sector over the past several years. Data center operators lease space and power capacity to customers under long-term contracts. And according to leasing data tracked by CBRE across major North American markets, wholesale data center leases for large blocks of capacity, meaning several megawatts or more, have been signed at rates commonly ranging from $100 to $200 per kilowatt per month in major markets. Though pricing has been rising steadily in the most supply-constrained markets, available capacity has become increasingly scarce. In the hottest markets, where available power capacity has effectively sold out years in advance, some new leases have been signed at meaningfully higher rates, reflecting the genuine scarcity of buildable, power-available capacity. The lease terms themselves are unusually long for commercial real estate, typically 10 to 15 years for large wholesale and hyperscale tenants, sometimes extending to 20 years for the largest custom-built facilities. And these leases are typically structured on a triple net basis, meaning the tenant bears the direct cost of their own power consumption, taxes, insurance, and maintenance, leaving the landlord with a highly predictable, contractually locked-in rental income stream for the duration of the lease. This is precisely why data centers have become one of the most sought-after asset classes for large institutional investors, pension funds, and real estate investment trusts over the past several years. A 15-year lease with an investment-grade cloud computing company functions almost like a corporate bond wrapped inside a piece of real estate, offering long-duration, highly predictable cash flow backed by tenants who are, almost without exception, among the largest and most creditworthy companies in the world. The artificial intelligence boom has poured gasoline on this already hot market. According to Synergy Research Group, which tracks global data center capacity, hyperscale cloud computing companies have been leasing and building capacity at a pace that has consistently outstripped new supply coming online. And this dynamic has been further intensified by the enormous computing demands of training and running large AI models, which require dramatically more power-dense infrastructure per server rack than traditional cloud computing workloads ever did. Several of the largest technology companies in the world have committed to data center capital expenditure plans running into the tens of billions of dollars annually. And a meaningful share of that capital is flowing directly into leasing agreements and joint development deals with data center owners and operators, rather than every facility being built entirely in-house. The volatility nobody wants to talk about. This might sound like one of the most reliably profitable businesses we've ever covered, and in many respects it genuinely is. But there are real structural risks lurking underneath the current boom, and understanding them matters precisely because so much capital is currently rushing into this sector based on the assumption that current conditions will simply continue indefinitely. The first risk is technological obsolescence, and it moves faster in this industry than in almost any other type of real estate. A data center built even 5 to 7 years ago, designed around the power density and cooling requirements of that era's computing equipment, can struggle to accommodate the dramatically higher power density and specialized liquid cooling infrastructure that modern AI computing chips require, meaning older facilities can face genuine functional obsolescence well before the underlying building itself has reached the end of its physical useful life. A very different failure mode than a golf course or a vineyard, where the land itself never becomes technologically outdated. This creates a growing bifurcation in the market between modern, AI-ready facilities capable of commanding premium rents from cutting-edge tenants, and older facilities increasingly relegated to lower margin, less demanding workloads, or facing expensive retrofit costs to remain competitive at all. The second risk is customer concentration. Because hyperscale leases are so large and long-term, a data center's entire revenue stream can depend on the continued health and expansion plans of a small handful of enormous tenants. And while these companies are currently among the most well-capitalized in the world, a meaningful slowdown in cloud computing or AI infrastructure spending, whether from an economic downturn, a shift in AI development economics, or simply a maturing of the current capital expenditure cycle, could leave developers who have overbuilt speculative capacity holding vacant, extremely expensive buildings with no immediate tenant to fill them. There has been genuine, well-documented industry discussion about whether the current pace of AI-driven data center construction represents sustainable long-term demand or a temporary capital expenditure surge that could soften once AI infrastructure build-outs mature. And several technology industry analysts have raised questions about whether current data center construction commitments are outpacing realistic long-term demand projections. The third risk is regulatory and community pushback, which has grown meaningfully as data centers have expanded into new markets. Local communities in several regions have organized opposition to new data center projects specifically over concerns about electricity demand driving up regional utility rates for ordinary residential customers, water consumption in drought-prone areas, and the relatively modest number of permanent jobs a data center creates once construction is complete compared to the enormous amount of land, power, and water it consumes. And some proposed projects have faced significant delays or been rejected outright following organized local opposition. The real case study, the power grid bottleneck. To understand how this industry's central structural challenge is playing out in real time, look at what's been happening across major utility service territories in Northern Virginia, the single largest concentration of data center capacity in the world. Dominion Energy, the primary utility serving the region, has publicly stated that data center electricity demand in its service territory has grown so dramatically that it has fundamentally reshaped the utility's long-term infrastructure planning, requiring billions of dollars in new transmission line and substation investment specifically to serve committed and anticipated data center load. According to reporting on this situation, some new data center projects in the region have faced multi-year waits simply to secure a confirmed electrical interconnection date, with utilities managing lengthy queues of proposed projects that collectively request far more power capacity than the regional grid can currently deliver, forcing utilities to prioritize which projects receive power connections first based on factors including project readiness and infrastructure timing. This bottleneck has become severe enough that it has genuinely reshaped where new data center development is happening, pushing major developers to increasingly consider secondary markets specifically because they offer a faster, more certain path to securing power, even when those markets lack some of the network connectivity advantages that made Northern Virginia the dominant hub in the first place. Some data center developers have responded by pursuing on-site power generation solutions, including natural gas generation and, increasingly, direct partnerships with nuclear power plant operators to secure dedicated power supply outside the constraints of the traditional utility grid entirely. A genuinely novel development that would have seemed unusual just a few years earlier and reflects just how severe the power capacity constraint has become. This situation illustrates the central structural reality of data center economics today. The industry's growth is not currently being limited by capital availability, tenant demand, or even land availability. It is being limited almost entirely by the physical capacity of the electrical grid to deliver power fast enough, a bottleneck that takes years of utility infrastructure investment to meaningfully resolve and cannot be solved simply by writing a bigger check to scenarios. Let's build the honest math the way an actual owner has to run it. In the good scenario, you develop a 100 megawatt hyperscale data center campus in a market with genuinely available power capacity, and you secure a 15-year triple net lease with a major cloud computing tenant before construction is even complete, locking in a rental rate reflecting current tight market conditions. Total development cost across land, construction, and infrastructure runs approximately $1 billion to $1.2 billion at roughly $10 to $12 million per megawatt. Annual rental income at even a conservative $150 per kilowatt per month across 100 megawatts of leased capacity generates roughly $180 million in gross annual rental revenue. Subtract the facility's own operating costs, electricity for cooling and infrastructure overhead, maintenance, security, insurance, and property taxes, which might run $20 million to $30 million annually for a facility this size, and you're left with a highly predictable annual operating profit in the range of $150 million, locked in contractually for 15 years against one of the most creditworthy tenants in the world, across the life of that lease, and assuming the facility remains technologically competitive throughout. This is an extraordinarily attractive, bond-like investment return profile, precisely why institutional capital has poured so aggressively into this sector. Now the harder scenario. You build a similar facility speculatively, without a signed lease in hand, betting that tenant demand will materialize by the time construction completes. A bet that has generally paid off during the recent boom, but carries genuine risk if market conditions shift. Construction takes 2 to 3 years, during which the AI infrastructure spending cycle that justified your original demand projection begins to moderate as several major cloud computing tenants scale back near-term capital expenditure growth after a period of extremely aggressive build-out. You complete your facility only to find fewer large tenants actively seeking new capacity than existed when you broke ground, and the tenants who are still shopping for space have more negotiating leverage than they did at the peak of the boom, pushing achievable lease rates below your original underwriting. Meanwhile, your facility, designed to the power density standards of 2 to 3 years earlier, faces early competition from newer developments built specifically around the latest generation of AI computing hardware with meaningfully different cooling and power requirements than what your building was designed around. The gap between these two scenarios is a modest difference in return. It's the difference between one of the most reliable, bond-like real estate investments available today and a half-built empty facility carrying enormous construction debt against uncertain lease-up timing in a market that moved onto newer infrastructure standards during your construction period. The real payoff, the difference between data center owners who build lasting wealth in this business and those who end up holding an expensive, half-empty building, comes down to a small number of disciplined choices made well before ground ever breaks. Securing genuine, contracted power capacity before committing serious construction capital, rather than betting on eventual grid availability, has become the single most important underwriting discipline in this industry given how severe the power bottleneck has become in the most desirable markets. Signing anchor tenant leases before or during construction, rather than building entirely speculatively, converts this business from a genuinely risky development bet into something closer to the predictable, bond-like income stream that has attracted so much institutional capital in the first place, and building with enough technical flexibility to accommodate the next several generations of computing hardware, rather than optimizing purely for today's requirements, protects against the genuine risk of functional obsolescence that makes this business meaningfully different from owning a warehouse or an office building. Assets that don't face the same relentless pace of underlying technological change. The land itself in this business, unlike a vineyard or a ranch, isn't really the asset that builds long-term wealth. The power infrastructure and the long-term contracted relationship with a creditworthy tenant is, which means this is fundamentally a business about securing scarce inputs, power capacity above all else, and locking in long-duration contracts with tenants who genuinely cannot afford to have their infrastructure fail. Which means the honest answer to whether owning a data center can make you rich is yes, emphatically, right now. During what may be one of the most favorable supply-demand imbalances real estate has seen in decades. But the owners who build lasting wealth are the ones securing power and signing tenants before they pour a single foundation, not the ones betting that the current AI infrastructure boom will simply keep absorbing whatever gets built indefinitely, without ever needing to check whether the grid or the market can actually keep up.